Hello, thanks so much for being here. You are looking excellent today. Okay, so I have a fun challenge for you. Today I'm asking you to continue telling a story that you started in week 2. So who remembers this? Yup, that little arrow is back because they have continued to learn and grow just like you. Right on. So I made a storyboard here that we can go through, and let me explain the basic action of the sequence. Okay, so this is the easy version of the storyboard here, and as usual, this version will just take you less time because there are fewer things to accomplish, and if you have less time, this is definitely the way to go, okay? So I'm starting here. Let me start with the first shot, and let's explain these all. Okay, so you've definitely seen this before, and this is the continuing story of the arrow after we left them, okay? And so they've just essentially pressed the render button, and this is right before the action starts, okay? So what do they do now? Well, they get the heck out of there, right? This shot is done, so I want them to leave screen, and I want you to do it in this particular way, which is that the arrow anticipates down first, okay, and then moves up quickly to the top. This is kind of a 3-part action that we're gonna do here. The first 2 parts are on this shot, and then the third one is on the shot we'll get to next, okay? So the first part of the action is it anticipates down, and then it moves up, right? And then the final of the 3 actions is that we cut and we come to this shot, okay, which is all new, and the arrow comes in and slows down, okay? So that's the third part. So what does the arrow do now? Well, part of our job for this animation is to bring a little bit more personality to the arrow, okay? So you could do this however you want, but the way I'm picturing this is that the arrow's now kind of in a new place, right? And it doesn't really know what to do. So it's gonna kind of like look around. I want it to kind of look at this keyframe and then look at this keyframe, you know, using rotation and scale or whatever it is that you wanna do. Just give the arrow a little bit of personality. And then when it's done with that beat, it's gonna move up here, okay? And then what it's gonna do is click down and drag a marquee around these 2 keyframes, which selects them. So now they have these blue outlines, okay? And then once it's done selecting them by dragging this marquee over, the arrow will let go and the marquee will disappear. And then we'll go down here and the arrow will move down and press this F9 button, which turns blue, okay? And when it does that, as you know, these become ease keyframes, right? They go from being linear to ease, okay? And then the arrow moves over and now presses the graph editor button, which turns blue, okay? And then that's the last action here, but it moves off. Just say it moves off to the left, then it would come in from the right here, okay? In that same gag that we've been doing so far, but with the speed set correctly now, okay? And however it is that it comes in, I want the arrow to move down here, okay? And grab this point, right? And then what it's gonna do, it's gonna click down and drag this point over here, and this curve is going to change as well, okay? And then unsurprisingly, it's gonna move over here and grab this point and drag this out and make this curve adjust as well, okay? And that's basically it. Finally, it just moves off screen however you want. All right, so that's the storyboard for the easy version. And now let's go ahead and look at the harder version. All right, so here at the start, the arrow, as before, moves down in anticipation and then it moves up, okay? This is the same as in the easy version, but this next shot is different, all right? So let's look at this, because this is definitely fun, and I love this shot, and I can't wait to see you animate it, but it's gonna be a little bit of a challenge, okay? In some way, this is like an anime shot, or that's how I think about it, right? So what happens is the arrow zooms up from the bottom, and it kind of lands in the middle of the frame here, okay? But there's all these strips that are zooming downward really fast, and kind of in like loops, like and it just looks like the arrow is flying really fast, even though it's actually just staying in the same position. And then at the end of it, the arrow will gain speed and move out from the top of the frame as well, okay? And I have an asterisk here because one thing is that the arrow could have some side-to-side motion on it, but the way that I'm gonna show you that is a little bit advanced, okay? So that's why I have the asterisk there, all right? So moving on, this blasts out from the top, all right? And then it comes in here, and this is the same shot as in the easier version, right? The arrow comes up and it looks around, it's got some personality, you do something with it, but then it moves up here and it will do the thing where it draws the marquee, it selects these 2 keyframes, okay? Then it moves down here just as before, presses the F9 button, these are turned into ease keyframes, okay? But here is the next difference, okay? The arrow moves over and presses this button, okay? And this turns blue, the graph editor button. But now, I want you to do a transition here where it's like we're zooming into the graph, okay? So what will happen is all of these elements moving up, the keyframes, the buttons, okay? These will all push out to like scale out and get bigger and kind of push past the edges of the frame. Zhoomph. And this is kind of empty here in the center, you'll see. So this will work this way, is that all these elements kind of push out and scale up together. And then kind of simultaneously, or maybe with a little bit of a delay or an overlap, these elements for the next shot all scale up as well from the center, okay? So yeah, so that's the transition, and then the rest of this will work the same. The arrow will move over, and it'll grab this handle, and it'll pull this curve out, and then it'll move over again and pull this curve out, okay? So that's all the same, and then it'll move off however you want, right? So that's the hard version. Before we jump into After Effects and look at the actual project I'm giving you, let me just explain one thing. I am definitely hoping that all of you, after watching my lesson, are psyched to try out adjusting your keyframes in the graph editor. It is definitely my sincere hope that you will look at every keyframe in the entire project in the speed graph and really try to figure out, okay, between this keyframe and the next one, how do I want the object to move? Is it accelerating? Is it losing speed and decelerating? How's it moving here, okay? The real assignment is for you to start feeling comfortable using the speed graph, because it is so essential to amazing motion. Okay, enough of that. Let's look at the project itself. Okay, so here in After Effects, we have the easy version and the hard version, okay, as I've just gone over. So let me start with the easy version. And let me just say right away that now that you know pre-comps, everything is set up now here with pre-comps, okay? Rather than like the nonsense from before where I gave you a comp with like 100 or so layers in it, now everything is separated neatly into pre-comps, right? So when you want to animate this first shot, you'll have to jump in here and look at it here, right? And I should also point out that I just took guesses about how long you want these shots to be, okay? You can definitely extend these or shorten these and move around the other pre-comps to make like a little edit the way you want, okay? So let me go over a couple of things that I want to talk about here. So let me jump in here to this first shot. All right, so now this really shouldn't be that difficult. Basically nothing animates except for the arrow here, but I just wanted to explain again how to quote unquote interpolate the anticipation action that I want you to have on this when it moves out in the speed graph, okay? So I just kind of want to show this again because I showed you how to work this in the speed graph on the scale animation of the arrow in my lesson. You know, when it got bigger, it clicked down and then reverted back to its original size. But I think I just need to review this again now to make sure it makes sense, right? So right here, I have a very simple explanation of a circle that moves down and then it moves up, okay? And I've kind of put keyframe timings in here, but right now these are all linear, right? So it looks like this, which is super boring, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and select these and press F9 to put some ease on there, put some handles on there. So the thing that I talked about in the lesson, and I think this is really important, is to think about it first is this frame, this keyframe rather. This is the anticipation, okay? When this moves down here, okay, what happens is it's gotta change directions, okay? It moves down and now it's gotta stop and change directions before it goes back up, okay? Which means it needs to pause here, okay? Because it's sort of like slowing down and then it's slowing back out of this point, okay? So you always want to think about the anticipation frame as having a pause. So if I go into my graph, okay, the way that I would do this was pull this out this way so that it kind of like eases in here and then pull this out this way so that it kind of eases out of there, right? Okay, so that's sort of a pause here. It takes a while, dips down to 0, okay? Now, the other thing about this is when it moves off screen here, I want it to be pretty much just gaining speed this whole time from this slow out, right? So, you know, depending on how far you want this to go, something like 90, I don't know. But this, you want to push in, you know, not all the way so that it's cranked, but so that it's just definitely getting faster as it goes out. And this will be to your eye, okay? So that's the second and third keyframe here, but this first one, I think it kind of matters the least here. You could just have a generic ease on there, I guess, if you want. But what I'm gonna do is just push this so it's happening a little bit faster at the start. Okay, so it would look like this. The essential thing is that pause when it moves down. Now, another thing that you can do is move around the keyframes, obviously, to, if this looks slow to you or whatever, you can push this faster to reduce the amount of time between here and here so that this will happen faster now, right? And I think that looks pretty good. But you could also try like pushing this frame closer and seeing how that looks. Basically, I encourage you to experiment as long as you're using this basic interpolation here where there's a big pause and it goes fast toward the end. Pause here, fast here, okay? That's the main thing, all right? So I can close this down. Let me talk about shot 2 now, because I think that's the only thing we need to talk about in shot 1, all right? So now let me go here. Okay, so this definitely has some complication to it. And I should point out that, all of the shots, I think I said this already, but all the shots that are in the easy version are also in the hard version, okay? So I'm gonna talk about them more now than when we go over the hard version, right? So the action of this shot, again, is the arrow comes up, and you're gonna bring some personality to this, I hope. Have it look over here, have it look over here. Either way, whatever it does, it goes up here and it marquees over, all right? And this is a little bit tricky. I need to kind of explain this marquee, okay? Because if you twirl this down, you want to twirl into the contents menu here. Here's your marquee stroke, and then here, and then here. Okay, this is the property that I think we're going to animate here. And I don't just think that. I know you're going to animate this path. Okay, so that's how you find it. You kind of twirl down and twirl down. Now, what I'm going to say is, I'm going to move forward in time a little bit here, okay? Definitely make sure to start off by making a path keyframe for this in this shape, okay? Because basically the way you're going to animate this is you're going to move forward in time, right? The arrow's coming over and it's going to click down and start here and it's going to drag this out to this position, right? So with this selected or with the path selected, what I can do is double click on here and now I get this kind of familiar bounding box and I can kind of like, I don't want to rotate this. What I want to do is like drop this down this way, okay? And you probably want to get in pretty close and make sure that that's going down to like kind of a single point there, right? And that's why I'm saying that it's way better to always make sure you've set this keyframe first, because if you just move this down to being this big, it'll be very hard to get in there all the way and pull it back out to this position, okay? So word to the wise. So just in case it's not clear, the arrow will move over, right? And click down on here. And then as the arrow moves over here, this animation will happen like that. So it'll look like the arrow is pulling this down, okay? And one other thing is you'll definitely want to make sure to adjust these keyframe timings and the arrow's keyframe timings together for this move in the graph, okay? So don't forget to do that, right? The rest of this should be fairly self-explanatory, I think. Everything else is just sort of turning things off and turning things on. So like once the marquee is drawn, then these keyframes, the keyframe outlines will turn on. Those are here, okay? And then eventually the keyframes will turn off and the ease keyframes will turn on, right? And the button for the F9 will turn blue and the button for the graph also will turn blue, right? Okay, I think that explains everything in that shot. Let me move on and take you here to this last shot. Okay, so this also has something that's a little bit tricky in it for sure, which is this Bezier. So let me explain this to you. This curve right here, let me solo this. Okay, this represents this curve. If I reveal also the path of this, okay, which looked like it was open already, but if it wasn't, contents, group 1, path, okay? So when I click on the path here, and then I just click on this one point, okay, I'm gonna shift click just to get that one point. If I get in close, now I can see that this actually has Bezier handles on it, okay? And just like with the other path animation, I definitely urge you to first make a keyframe in this position, okay? And then move in time. Now, you're gonna need to get in here, and I think if you just select this, yep, now I've got my regular arrow. Now I can see this Bezier. So now I've moved in time, and I will wanna pull this handle, okay? And now actually this is pretty important. You'll wanna make sure that you know where this handle goes to, like maybe by dropping a guide here, okay? This is what I would do. I would either drop a guide or undo that. Right now this is soloed, but there's actually a grid here that's underneath this. So what you can do is, right, just make sure when you select this second path here that this has been pulled, for example, look, I did this already too, like exactly here on the grid, all right? So you just have a sense of where this Bezier handle is, either with a guide or by using this grid, okay? Because when I click out of this now, that Bezier handle disappears. And I need to line up a few other things to exactly that point, right? So the way that this animation is gonna work is this Bezier, right? This is just one of 4 things that essentially needs to happen here. This pulls out, right? And it pulls out to like here, okay? But also you've got, here, let me show you this. You've got these 3 things that make up the Bezier on this side, okay? And these are fake essentially, right? But they have to move like they're the real Bezier. So here's my curve. And if you recall, I pulled this out to, let's see, on the grid, I think it was here. This is why it's important to drop a guide, okay? But whatever, like wherever that is, you just wanna pull this over to wherever that handle went to, okay? Just say it was right there. And then you've got this line here as well. So now this needs to be animated with scale, where I've done that thing where I've unchained the scale, and then you can animate this way, and that will also need to animate to the same exact place as the sort of middle of this ball or whatever, which would be pretty much exactly where that Bezier handle was pulled. So you definitely need to drop a guide or use this grid here, okay? And then the final thing is that the arrow also will need to pull that over and land at that same place too. So this animation is gonna happen with 4 different actions, okay? The Bezier path of the actual curve is gonna pull over. Then we're gonna have the fake end of the handle and the line of the handle and the arrow all pull over to that exact spot, okay? And all those keyframes need to happen together, and they all need to be adjusted in the graph together, okay? So that'll be basically like 2 sets of 4 keyframes or 8 keyframes that'll all be adjusted together for that one moment, okay? And same with when the arrow moves over here, it'll have to do the same thing on the other side, okay? So that is the easy version. All right, well, I hope that seems like fun to you. Let's move on to look at the harder version. The first shot is the same in both versions, so I don't need to talk about that. So let's move on to the second shot, which is unique to the hard version, okay? And let me jump in here and explain a few things about this right away. Okay, so the first thing that I need to explain is that I have separated the position for all of these layers. And this is not something we've ever talked about before. So if you press P, you'll see that right now, for example, for this strip here, okay? This has an X position and a Y position values, and this is not the way we're used to looking at this. So if I basically right click on here, I can unseparate the positions, and then that looks like this, which is what we're used to, okay? But in this case, I know that you're only gonna animate all these strips and the arrow just on the Y axis, up and down, okay? So I went ahead and separated this, all right? So if you right click on here and go to separate dimensions, you can separate the dimensions into X and Y position. You can only do this with position, okay? But now you could just move this up and down this way, all right? And it's only on the Y. I just needed to explain that. Now, another thing that I need to explain about this is that this essentially is gonna have some parallax in it, okay? And I will explain what parallax is, which is, parallax is the idea that in 3D space, things that are closer to us appear to be moving faster generally, and things that are farther away appear to be moving slower. So for example, when you're on a train and you're looking out the window and you're going really fast, the trees in the foreground look like they're kind of whipping by, and the mountain in the background just looks like it's standing in one position, okay? So the way this is gonna work in this case is I have these top stripes here, and these are all bigger. They're wider and fatter than the bottom stripes, which are all here, okay? Because these wanna look like they're closer to us, like further up, essentially. If we're looking down at this scene, they're on top of the arrow, and they're on top of these background stripes, okay? So we want these to move a little bit faster than the background stripes, right? So with the positions separated, now how do I actually want these to animate, all right? So let's think about this for one sec. First of all, I want them to all be moving down, okay? So it looks like the arrow is rushing forward, okay? So what I wanna do, for example, is take this and move this up top here, okay? And I'm gonna show you this advanced method of how to actually work this, all right? So essentially, if you didn't know this method, the way that you would do this was like this, okay? You would make a Y position keyframe here, move like 10 frames, for example, and move this down here, okay? So right now, this would look like this, right? Which is kind of what we want. but then you want it to happen again and again and again, right? So you could move like one frame and take these keyframes and copy and paste them, and now it would kind of loop like that, right? But just say you wanted to put some space here between when it loops again, all right? So if you pushed this back here, you'd essentially be creating an animation where this animates back up. So that's kind of silly. Well, that's exactly not what you want. So in order to compensate for that, you could, for example, go one frame past this keyframe and now copy and paste this keyframe there. So there's a pause where it's down at the bottom, and then it would like go down and pause and then go down again, right? So that's sort of closer to what you want. And you could like do that for the whole layer, for the whole comp, right? But this is a little bit ugly. This one keyframe here right next to this one, like if we zoom back, it's sort of hard to tell at a glance that there's even two keyframes there. And I don't know, I think we're just adding a lot more keyframes here. So there's a much more elegant way to do this. So if I delete all these, okay, the way I would do this is by using an expression. So if you don't know, expressions are JavaScript code that you can write in After Effects. I know. Now, for some people, this is a really advanced idea. Like if you don't know any JavaScript at all, for example.
I can do this. I can do this.
But some people here might know a bunch about JavaScript, so this is for you, or for anybody that wants to try something that's a little bit more advanced. Okay, so let me explain how to actually add an expression to this layer, right? So the way you would do that is for any layer, you would option and click on the stopwatch, okay? And when you do that, the values turn red, you get like all this new stuff here, okay? And most importantly, a text box opens here, right? You can type things in, right? So if I hit delete, now this is where I can write my JavaScript expression, all right? So you're just gonna have to take my word that this is what you do, all right? So I'm gonna write the words loop out, okay, with a lowercase L, O-O-P, and then an uppercase O-U-T, okay? And this, down here, this is just kind of giving me what After Effects thinks I'm trying to write. It's just a helpful little expression helper. So I click on this, or I hit return, okay? And now this is giving me what I want, which is loop out. Again, this is written camel case, so it's a lowercase L at the beginning with no space between and then an uppercase O, okay? And then in the parentheses, what you need to write is quote cycle, C-Y-C-L-E, okay? And it prompts you and you can just hit yes, that's what I want. Loop out, parentheses, quote cycle, quote end parentheses, okay? And when I click out of that, now check this out. It's just gonna loop those two keyframes forever for my whole comp, okay? Right, so that's awesome. That is hopefully the first expression that you've ever seen before, okay? Really helpful in this case. But let me take this one step farther, okay? And explain how now I can actually do the same thing as before. See, what this is doing essentially is, as soon as it reaches this keyframe and then I go one frame past, it's now going back to this keyframe and then looping again, all right? So right now that creates no space between these. So if I wanted some space between them, it's kind of like with before. I could just say, let's say I go like 5 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I could just copy this keyframe and paste it there, okay? And that makes like a little pause before it loops back to this keyframe, okay? Which we'll do now one frame after this keyframe, okay? So now it'll just loop and pause and loop and pause, okay? And if I want the pause to last longer, I can drag this out and now it'll loop, pause, right? So yeah, so that's super, super useful. And that is definitely how I would suggest you animate all of these strips, right? Remember, for the ones in the foreground, if you want them to move faster, all you'd really have to do is push the keyframes closer together. And if you want the ones in the background to move a little bit slower, you just pull the keyframes apart, right? The timing between these first two keyframes sets the speed of the animation, and these two keyframes sets the duration of the pause, essentially. Okay? One more quick note about all of this is that I think these keyframes here, the ones that are involved with the loop out, these should stay linear, as you want the strips to just be moving at a steady rate throughout the entire animation, all right? So these are probably the only keyframes that you're not going to adjust in the graph editor at all. Cool. I love expressions. There is one for you. Now moving on, okay, I'm gonna close that down and I'm actually gonna delete all this, all right? Let me delete this. And oh, this is really instructive. If I delete these keyframes, I will get an expression error like this, okay? Now this is like, uh-oh, an expression error, da, da, da. And what this basically means is this loop out cycle, it only works with keyframes. So right now it's like, hey, I have no keyframes to loop. So what do you want me to do? And I don't know, I'm creating an error, all right? So basically all you would have to do is click in here and just delete that code out of there and you would get rid of this error. Okay, so that is the loop expression and it's super useful. Loop out cycle. Now, I want to talk about one other expression here. I think that would be useful. So all these strips are like whipping past, right? The arrow comes in and hangs out here in the middle, all right? But I don't want it to look like it's still. I still want it to feel like it's moving, like it has force being acted on it, like gravity or wind or whatever, right? So this is kind of an anime thing. But I think the way that to do this, I would want to have this wiggle back and forth on the x-axis, okay? So I've also separated the dimensions, the position, I should say, of the arrow, okay? So now you'll be animating the y here, all right? But you can put an expression on the x to make it kind of wiggle back and forth like it's vibrating or something, and that is the wiggle expression. The wiggle expression is really fun and easy. It's generally the first expression that people learn, okay? So the wiggle expression is like this. I will option and click on my x position here, right? Now this turns red, meaning there's an expression there. You get all this stuff, which I'll explain in a bonus lesson probably, and then this text box here, right? So I want to delete this here, and here's my expression. I want to type wiggle, okay? And then it's prompting me, yep, so I'll hit return, and now wiggle, and then it's giving me parentheses here again. Now wiggle, the way this works is it wants two values here separated by a comma, okay? The first value is what's known as the frequency, which is how many times per second do you want this to wiggle? And when I say wiggle, I really just mean change directions. So how many times a second do I want this to change directions? Okay, and this here, after the comma, is the amount of pixels that I want it to move when it does change directions, okay? So in a 30 frames per second comp, the maximum number of times I can have it wiggle really is 30. But then that would be wiggling on every frame, which would be a lot, okay? Maybe. So here I'm gonna type 15, okay, which means it's just wiggling on like every other frame, all right? And then here, in terms of the number of pixels that it actually wiggles, well, this is completely up to you. You could set it to something kind of on the smaller end, like 15 here, and it would look like this, okay? Right? And that's pretty fun. But you could also change these around and experiment with this a lot. Like for example, if you did set this to like 30, what would that look like? Well, it would wiggle more. It's more of like a jitter, right? And if you set this down to like something like 5, this is the frequency, remember, then it would wiggle more slowly, right? Similarly, I'm gonna put that back to 15 and 15 just by undoing. And now like, just let me put this to like 150 pixels instead of 15, right? Now it would look like this, which is probably too much, but I don't know, maybe that's what you're looking for, okay? So experiment with this if you try to use this wiggle. I think it's just really fun, and you can just have it wiggle the whole time, right? So if you want to get rid of this, you just delete that out, and now there's no expression on there. Cool. And you do not have to do this. You could also just animate that wiggle with position or whatever. But in any case, this shot's really fun, and I can't wait to see how you animate it. Great. So this shot is the same except for the transition. So let's talk about this transition here for one sec, all right? So basically, I've left you with guides here in the center of the comp, okay? And that's my little reminder for you. Now you remember, what I wanna have happen is the arrow comes in and it selects these two at the marquee, and then it moves down here, it presses the F9, and then it moves over here and it presses the graph editor button, okay? And when this presses down, this is gonna be the trigger for the animation, okay? So you press that, and then what I wanna have happen is that all of the elements in here, the words, these will be the ease keyframes at that point, but whatever, the keyframes, okay? And the buttons and all this stuff, what I wanted to do is scale up, all right? But I want the center of all of these layers to be in the center of comp. For example, right now, let me turn off these keyframes, okay? Let me turn all this off, and I would have my ease on there, right? So now I deliberately left the anchor point of this ease keyframe in the center of the layer, okay? What you're gonna need to do is get in here and choose your pan behind tool, Y, all right? And then move this to the center of comp, which is right here. Basically, if you click this button on right here, you will turn on and off the title or action safety. And so it's very hard to see here, but this is the exact center of comp. And if I just make sure that, for example, this ease keyframe icon, right? Now that that's set to the center of comp, okay? So when this scales up, I just really want to point this out. When this scales up, it scales up this way, okay? It moves off screen, right? So that's kind of the transition, that I'm talking about, that everything on screen will kind of move off from the center, okay? Let me undo that, because in this final shot, because there's a big empty hole right here in the center, so if all this moves off, and then we cut to this final shot here, all this stuff, like the curve and all these elements and everything, can also have their anchor points in the center and get bigger essentially from small to, while this is getting bigger, this will also be getting bigger from small to normal size. This is easier to explain with hand gestures and mouth sound effects, like so many things in motion graphics, right? So I want the first elements to move off screen like this, zoom, okay? While the second set starts little and at the same time, or with a little bit of overlap, okay, goes from small to large like zoom, okay? So one goes zoom and one goes zoom, okay? And I should say that what you wanna do here actually is move in the main comp, in the hard main comp, is move this up to the top, okay? And create some overlap between these two so that actually while the keyframes and stuff are getting bigger and moving off, you can actually start this next animation happening with the curve or whatever small and with this word, okay? So that that's all getting bigger with some amount of overlap as the keyframes and buttons and things are also getting bigger, right? So it's kind of like we're zooming through one to get to the other. We're zooming through this and we're finding this, all right? Okay, so there's just one other thing I need to explain about this transition, and then I think we're done here. And that has to do with this shot, all right? So if I jump in here, the way this is made, and I definitely explained this when I went over the easy version, okay? At the end of the curve, there's a point here, right? And then there's also a line, and that has an end on it as well, okay? And these are like our fake Bezier handles. Now, I think what you wanna do is at the start of this shot, if you're doing the transition, have these turned off, okay? And those will only come on when the arrow comes over here and like selects this point or clicks on that point, then you can have these come on, and then you can have the arrow grab it and move it over and do that animation that we talked about, okay? But I think at the start, for the transition, you'll want these off, okay? Because the anchor points for those kind of want to be in specific places. Like for the line, it really needs to be, you know, at the end of the line so we could do that scale animation. So you can't put the anchor point for this in the center of the comp. Anyway, I think it's better if when the arrow comes over and clicks on this, that's when the Bezier handles appear anyway. That's the way it would work in real life. But, so when you make this transition, the scale transition, okay, the easing out, right now this has its anchor point set to the middle of the comp, and the curve also has its anchor point set to the middle of the comp. So when these scale, they'll do this correctly, right? It'll be like this or something. And I think also the grid, yeah, the grid as well is set with the anchor point to the center of comp, so this can scale up as well if you want to do that, right? However, I've definitely left these 2 points here, this one and this one, okay? These have their anchor points in the center of the layer, okay? So you just want to watch out for that because, for example, if I have these on, if I have these selected, I should say, and then I select my curve, and then I scale all these, they will not move together. So look at that, right? So the scale of the curve is working the way we want, but it's not working on those points because the anchor point's in the center, all right? So that's one thing you're gonna have to change if you want those points on when the transition happens, okay? And I think that's pretty much it. Now, you know, the rest of the shot I explained in easy and then it moves off at the end, all right? So yeah, so that's it for going over this project. Okay, good luck with it. And just in case it wasn't clear, just make sure to adjust, or at least try to adjust, every keyframe in the graph editor. And not just because I say it's a good idea, but because it will give you a lot more control over your animation. And that's what you ultimately want. Control over everything. Right on. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you soon. Good luck with this. I can't wait to see what you do.